Good afternoon, and welcome to yet another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. So, for the last several months, as you know, we've been covering modern English Bible translations. We started back with Wycliffe and moved on to Tyndale and Matthew Bible, the Coverdale Bible, the Great Bible, the Bishop's Bible, King James, and on and on. We've recently covered the Net Bible. That was our last episode. Today we take a little turn in that we will talk about a very important person in the field of Bible translation. If you pick up nearly any modern English translation today, chances are you're reading a translation that has been influenced in some way by Eugene Nida. Who is Eugene Nida? What did he contribute to Bible translations, and why are his theories so important? Well, that's what we hope to delve in today in a small way. To summarize, he was born November 11th, 1914. He died August 25th, 2011. Eugene Albert Nida was an American linguist who developed his dynamic equivalence theory of Bible translation. He's widely recognized as one of the foremost linguists and translation theorists of the 20th century. Such was his influence that his obituary was recorded by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. Nida was born in Oklahoma City, but at age 5, his parents moved to Long Beach, California. He became a Christian at an early age and soon developed a goal to become a missionary. He went to UCLA, and there he majored in Greek and Latin and received his bachelor's in classics. He thought he might work in Bible translation in Africa, so he studied the work of linguists Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield. He graduated in 1936, summa cum laude. He was a member of Phi Beta Kappa and earned one of the highest GPAs in the university's history. At a Bible club at UCLA, he learned of the work of Cameron Townsend, founder of Wycliffe Bible Translators. In 1936, Nida studied and taught at Townsend's summer linguistic camp and then went briefly to Mexico to undertake translation work himself. But poor health forced him to return to California, where in 1939 he completed a master's degree in New Testament Greek at the University of Southern California. He then studied linguistics under Charles C. Fryer at the University of Michigan, where he completed his PhD in 1943. His dissertation was entitled A Synopsis of English Syntax, and it presented the first full-scale analysis of any major language using a theory known as immediate constituent analysis. Please don't ask me to explain that. Also in 1943, Nida was ordained by the Northern Baptist Convention in California. In the same year, he married Althea Lucille Sprague, and he joined the American Bible Society Translation Department. Initially, this appointment was part-time only, and he continued to spend every summer until 1953 teaching at the Summer Institute of Linguistics, now known as SIL International. Now, side note, SIL is an evangelical Christian nonprofit organization whose main purpose is to study, develop, and document languages, especially those that are lesser known, and to expand linguistic knowledge, to promote literacy, to translate the Christian Bible into local languages, and to aid in minority language development. This was a perfect fit for Eugene Nida. In 1946, several national Bible societies, including the American Bible Society, joined together for mutual support and formed the United Bible Societies, an organization that still exists. Nida was present at the founding meeting, and subsequently he was responsible for shaping the translation programs of the new organization. For more than 50 years, Eugene Nida was the leader of the translation program of the American Bible Society, and subsequently the intellectual leader of the global program of the United Bible Societies, as well as a consultant to that organization. At the May 14th, 1953 meeting of the American Bible Society in New York City, he said, "The demand is not only for more Bibles, but for more easily understood ones. Peoples of the world want the Bible not as a mark of social responsibility, but to read it, to understand it, and to be transformed by its message." Nida's work was defined by his insistence that the Bible translations be accessible to the people for whom they were intended. After joining the Bible Society in 1943, he visited scores of countries, up to 200, his late wife reported, where he recruited native speakers and trained them as translators. Previously, most Bible translators had been done by Western missionaries, who rarely had great familiarity with the local language and culture. Nida, on the other hand, visited these countries, made friends with the locals, and tried as best he could to understand local culture, local idioms, local metaphors, local similes, local language, and those phrases that were particular to that particular language. Not surprisingly, the missionaries before him, in their word-for-word translations, resulted in stiff, unpleasant to read, and frankly difficult to understand by the people for whom it was intended. Nida drew on linguistics, anthropology, and communication theory, and devised an approach to translation known as dynamic equivalence. Later, he preferred the term functional equivalence, but it is still known by both terms. When translated back into English, some of the Bible passages that Nida's work produced yielded a resonant poetry, so to speak. And the New York Times reported in 1955, in an article about his work, they said that the phrase, "I am sorrowful," gets a variety of translations for tribes in Central Africa, such as, "My eye is black," "My heart is rotten," "My stomach is heavy," or "My liver is sick." In English and some cultures, when we speak of deeply emotional subjects, we refer to the heart. Other cultures refer to the liver, or maybe the stomach. And so it must be translated as to be so understood by the local language. He paid extreme attention to the local culture, language, and idioms for those who were to receive a Bible translation. His career in Bible translation spanned the globe, and he traveled to hundreds of countries throughout his life. He moved to Brussels later in life so he could continue to speak English, Spanish, and French on a daily basis with the young translation scholars of Europe. Nida's theory and approach, valuable as they were, could not have carried the day if he had not dedicated himself to spreading these ideas through years of travel and teaching, and through building up teams of consultants and teachers. During his 93 years, he wrote more than 50 books and scores of articles on translation theory, on linguistics, on Greek lexicography, and cultural anthropology. The two most complete presentations of his theory would be, number one, Toward a Science of Translation, published 1964, and secondly, The Theory and Practice of Translation in 1969, co-authored with Charles Tabor. Bibles that are heavily shaped by this translation philosophy include The Good News for Modern Man, which is the first extensive use of his dynamic equivalence approach, and also the contemporary English version, the New Living Translation, the New Century Version, and others. But on the other end of the spectrum of Bible translation philosophy are Bibles that follow the formal equivalence, often called literal or word-for-word philosophy, such as the King James Version, the New King James, Revised Standard Version, the English Standard Version. Most modern English Bibles sit somewhere between both ends of this spectrum, and many Bibles which don't fully embrace Nida's approach still are nevertheless influenced by it. Those two very important works that we mentioned were his first book-length efforts to expound his theory in what he called dynamic equivalence, later to be called functional equivalence. How significant, revolutionary, and convincing this new approach proved to be can be seen in the fact that hundreds of Bible translations have now been effectively carried out with this methodology throughout the world. In essence, this approach enables the translator to capture the meaning and spirit of the original language without being bound to its linguistic structure. Nida's work with United Bible Societies led to a series of books specifically designed for Bible translators to help them translate with the principles of functional equivalence. This series is called the UBS Handbooks for Translators and covers all the books of the Old Testament, the New Testament, as well as the deuterocanonical books, also called the Apocrypha. Dr. Nida contributed to 11 of these volumes personally, but all are written by scholars influenced by his method. I have 7 of these volumes in my own library, such and are these: A Translator's Handbook on the Gospel of Mark, and other volumes on translating Philippians, John, Galatians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Peter, and so forth. They are excellent as actually not only translation aids, but in terms of their commentary on the text. So, well worth the money. Frankly, you might be lucky and find these for $1 each at some local bookstore, used bookstore, which is exactly what I did. Nida gave up the standard terminology used throughout history, such as literal translation, free translation, and faithful translation. On the contrary, he advocated 2 equivalent ways as the basic directions and guidelines for translation. And those are, of course, dynamic equivalence, known also as functional equivalence, and formal equivalence. How did he define these 2 terms, formal and functional equivalence? Well, formal equivalence refers to a literal, word-for-word translation approach. The primary goal is to stay as close to the original source text as possible in your translation. In formal equivalence, the translation preserves the lexical details, grammatical structure, vocabulary, and syntax of the original text. It therefore assumes that the reader will be familiar with the cultural and linguistic context of the source language and doesn't need an explanatory or alternate modern reading. It puts the burden on the reader to know those references. An interlinear Greek text is an extreme example of what a strict formal translation might look like. Let's take, for example, an interlinear Bible and look at Genesis 1, verse 1. In the Hebrew, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Hebrew is read from right to left, and if you were to translate it strictly formally, without regard for word order, into modern English, it would sound like this: In the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth. Of course, translators would not normally render the verse this way, but it is an example of severe formal translation. Nida criticized those who are intent on preserving the literary form over the meaning by giving an example from 2 Corinthians 10, 14 through 16, as reflected in the New American Standard Bible, which reads, For we are not overextending ourselves as if we did not reach to you, for we were the first to come even as far as you in the gospel of Christ. not boasting beyond our measure, that is, in other men's labors, but with the hope that as your faith grows, we shall be within our sphere enlarged even more by you, so as to preach the gospel even to the regions beyond you, and not to boast in what has been accomplished in the sphere of another. Now, this is one long sentence. And of this translation, Nida says, the Greek of this passage is not stylistically bad, but the English butchering of it is hacking at its worst. And I think you can understand what he means by that. Here are some examples of formal equivalent translations compared to functional. In Psalm 23:5, the New King James Version, a formal translation, reads, "You anoint my head with oil." Now, of course, there's a Middle Eastern practice, an ancient Middle Eastern practice of hospitality, of greeting guests with anointing their head literally with oil. Some cultures, that would make absolutely no sense. So the Good News Bible translated more generally as, "You welcomed me as an honored guest." In Amos chapter 4, verse 6, the New King James Version says, "Also I gave you cleanness of teeth in all your cities, and lack of bread in all your places." That phrase, cleanness of teeth, sounds strange to modern ears, but the Good News Bible says, "I was the one who brought famine to all your cities," and it captures the meaning perfectly. In Exodus 33, verse 3, a land of milk and honey becomes a rich and fertile land in functional equivalent translation. In Zechariah 2, verse 8, "For he who touches you touches the apple of his eye," becomes, "Anyone who strikes you strikes what is most precious to me." In Psalm 60, verse 8, "I will throw my sandal on Edom," becomes, "And I will throw my sandal on Edom as a sign that I own it," an explanatory phrase of that ancient idiom. In Psalm 51, verse 7, "Purge me with hyssop, and I shall be clean. Wash me, and I shall be whiter than snow," becomes, in functional equivalent, "Remove my sin, and I will be clean." Similarly, in Haggai 1, verse 6, "And he who earns wages to put into a bag with holes," becomes, "And workers cannot earn enough to live on." Now, there are critiques of functional equivalent in that, in general, you could slip into a more interpretive mode and misrepresent the original meaning if you're not extremely careful. And that's a valid concern. But one typical critique by an author goes this way. He says, "Thought for thought presents the intended meaning of the author, which the original audience would have understood during the time of the writing was originally created. Therefore," this fellow says, "readers put a great deal of faith in the translators as they are trusting their interpretation." Now, it's as if interpretation is only done when you translate dynamically or thought for thought. Wrong. All translation, even literal translation, involves interpretation. It is unavoidable. Choices must always be made in word translation, where sentences begin and end, and how to translate idioms. It's not simply a one-for-one substitution of words and sentences. All translation, literal or otherwise, involves interpretation. A common critique, another critique of the Good News Translation and some functional equivalent Bibles is that they promote theological error. And one critic has this to say: "Many dangerous theological errors are found throughout the Good News Bible, including distortions of the divinity of Christ, removing references to Jesus' blood, misrepresentations of Jesus' virgin birth, removing references to hell, salvation being distorted, etc. The cost of theological confusion is too great a price to pay to rely on this version of the Bible as a source of truth. And this critic gives a comparison from Matthew 16 through 18 as an example of how the Good News Bible introduces heresy. So here's the translation in the Good News Bible. Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." "Good for you, Simon, son of John," answered Jesus. "For this truth did not come to you from any human being, but it was given to you directly by my Father in heaven. And so I tell you, Peter, you are a rock, and on this rock foundation I will build my church, and not even death will ever be able to overcome it." And then the ESV translation, a formal translation, is given as an example and contrast of a more faithful rendering, in which the ESV says, "Simon Peter replied, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.'" Now, maybe I'm missing something, but I do not see a significant difference in meaning between these two translations. I fail to get where any theological error has been introduced. If you see it, please comment and let me know, because I don't get it. Now, other examples can be cited from critics, and I'll link to those in the description below. But most of them boil down to choices that have to be made about which Greek text will be used in the translation. And as Greek texts vary, some words or phrases or sentences may be missing from some of these Bibles, but it is not in an attempt to introduce heresy. It is not a devilish, fiendish mode to throw the church into turmoil or to confuse readers. It's simply a case of which Greek text will be used. And of course, decisions on wording that the translators believed most reflected the meaning of the text. So, I don't think the Good News translation is filled with heresy. I don't think the translators were bound to leave out verses or discredit the deity of Christ. Simply pick one up, study it yourself, and come to your own conclusions. There's so much more we could say about formal and functional equivalence translations, and even about the Good News Bible. The Good News Bible is written in a simple, everyday language with the intention that everyone can appreciate it, and so it's often considered particularly suitable for children and those learning English. Over 244 million copies of the Good News Bible have been distributed worldwide since its first printing. The Good News Bible and other functional equivalent translations make the Bible understood in clear and simple English to millions of new readers around the world. And to me, that's a reason to celebrate. Dr. Nida died on August 25th, 2011 in Madrid. And his biographer, Philip C. Stein, wrote this: "When the history of the church in the 20th century is written, the name of Eugene Nida will figure prominently. Nida brought about a revolution in the field of translation, which resulted in millions of people in hundreds of languages gaining access to the Bible in an unprecedented way. The resulting impact on the growth and development of the church will continue to be felt throughout this century. I heartily agree and recommend to you the work of Eugene Nida." So, next week, we will continue in translations, personalities who contributed to great translations, and frankly, haven't decided exactly what topic to cover. But it will be interesting. Hopefully, will be enlightening. So if you found this video and others helpful, like, subscribe, and share this channel. We hope to educate theological concepts, biblical archaeology, history of interpretation, and so forth, on a level where everyone can understand. These things do not need to remain in the high ivory towers of academia and scholarship. So, Thank you for listening to this episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts, and we'll see you next week.